Hey quilters, this is Sarah from Snugglebug Stitching, and today we are looking at the third version of my Partial Dreams quilt. This is the one that I made the top for during my most recent quilt along. And you see here this lovely label, custom made corner label. I get these from Melanie over at Southern Charm Quilts. Everybody always asks me where I get them, so that's where I get them, and I'll have a link for you in the description. Today I'm going to go over how I attach these labels with this exposed chunky top stitch. So let's get to it. Okay, so we're going to put this lovely label onto the corner of my quilt, the back corner of my quilt. So I've got my label, I've got my quilt here, I've got a needle, and this is just a regular needle, but it does have a pretty big eye just to make it a little bit easier for threading. And I've got my thread. This is the same color thread that I used to quilt the quilt with. This is Missouri Star Quilt Company thread. It is their cotton quilting thread in 50 weight, and the color is plum. And I've got a glue stick. This is Elmer's washable school glue in the purple, the disappearing purple. So let's thread our needle first. So I'm going to, I've got the thread already going in, but I'm going to double it over, and I'll cut that extra off. And you just want to be sure that your thread is long enough that it's going to go all the way across the label. So I'll show you how I tie this knot. It's a pretty easy way to tie a knot. So you're going to wrap the thread around your index finger, and then put it in between your index finger and your thumb, and when you roll your fingers like that and pull, you'll have this little jagged knot left, and this is going to be caught up in the binding, so you won't see it. So now our needle's threaded. So when you get your label, it's going to come as a square, and you fold it over, and you'll attach that to the back corner. I like to put it on the back bottom right corner of the quilt, and then when you flip it around, it'll look like it's on the bottom left corner of the quilt, but I like to put it right there. So we've got our quilt quilted and trimmed, and this is the point where you want to put this label on before you bind it. So the first thing I like to do, sorry, just trying to get this where you can see it. First thing I like to do is to get the label, and I'm going to glue these two sides of the label together. And like I said, just Elmer's washable school glue. This is disappearing purple, but you can use the regular school glue. I've also used the Target brand knockoff, and it works good too. So got that glued together, and I'm going to glue, once I have the two sides of the label glued together, I'm going to glue the actual label to the quilt so that it'll stay put for us when we attach the label. And if your label's not folded completely square, that's not a big deal, because after we get this label attached, we can trim off that extra. And so you'll end up with this side of the label folded over, and then these raw edges will get caught up in the binding. So you won't have any unfinished edges that are exposed. So now that we've got that, we're going to take our thread, and we're going to get our needle, and we're going to go in, and I don't know if you can see this from the video, but we're going to go in these layers in between the front and back of the quilt. It doesn't matter whether you catch the binding or not, and we're going to start sewing really close to the top of the label. You want to make sure that if you've got any graphics on it, like I do, that you don't sew into those graphics. And for the thread, this thread is not necessarily specific to hand quilting, and this is just a regular needle. For just this small amount right here across the top of this line that you're going to quilt, it really doesn't matter. I would just pick a color that's a pretty color. This particular color is the same color that I quilted the quilt with. So we're going to start quilting, and I'm just going to change this angle so you can see it a little bit better. So you can take one stitch at a time, or you can do the rocking motion like you would do with hand quilting. You just want to be sure that you sew between the layers and don't poke through to the other side, or else you'll have a weird line. This exposed chunky top stitch looks great on the back and doesn't make a line on the front. So that's kind of one of the advantages to it. And it's okay if you catch the batting in there, just so that you don't go through to the other side. And I'm kind of trying to keep an angle so that you can see. So it does look kind of weird. So I just took 3 stitches at a time there. We're going to pull that through. And if you're not used to hand stitching, which I'll be honest, I don't do a whole lot of hand stitching. These labels are the only hand stitching I do. If you're not used to hand stitching, that's fine. One at a time is fine. And if your stitches aren't perfect, that's fine too, because the whole point of this is that it looks like hand stitch. So we're just gonna take a few stitches at a time, or you can just take 1 stitch at a time. So if you're just going to do 1 stitch at a time, that's fine. You're only going to be sewing about 8.5, 9 inches or so. So it's still not going to take that long, even if you just did 1 stitch at a time. All right, so you probably don't want to see me sit here and sew. So I'm going to pause the video, and then I'll meet you back at the end when I show you how to tie this off. All right, so now that we are on our last stitch, I'm going to come in on my last stitch, and I'm going to put my needle through the layers of the quilt. So you can see there, you can see that I am going sort of through the batting there. So I'm going to pull that last stitch through. And then I'm going to get my scissors, and I'm going to cut. And then I'm going to grab my seam ripper. And what I'm going to do, and this is probably overkill because this edge will be in your binding anyway, but I'll do it anyway. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull one of the threads out, just one. I can get them separate here. Grab hold of one here so it won't come out. So I'm going to pull just one of the threads out and leave the other going through that middle layer of the quilt. And I'm just going to tie this off a few times. And that's going to secure that. Like I said, probably overkill, because this is going to be, this edge is going to be in the binding of your quilt anyway, but do it anyhow. So there we go. We've got our label attached with a pretty hand stitch in a nice color. This is not a blind stitch, obviously. This is a hand stitch. It is meant to be obvious. I like to use a nice obvious color. Don't do a whole lot of hand stitching other than these labels, so when I do, I want it to be pretty obvious. The reason I doubled over the thread is actually to make it a little thicker, so that's a nice obvious stitch. And then where I have my labels weren't exactly even, I'm just gonna grab my rotary cutter and my ruler, and I'll trim those off before I bind it. Okay, so now that my label is sewn on, you can kind of see where I didn't get it on there completely evenly when I was putting it on there. So we're just gonna trim that off right now before we bind it. I've got my Missouri Star rotary cutter and a square Olfa ruler. This is just a 12.5 inch, as long as it's big enough to cover where the label is. It doesn't really matter what size ruler you use, just a square ruler. So we're just going to trim off that excess. And now it is all squared up and ready to bind.